Hello, everyone, and welcome to Museum of the Moving Image online. My name is Sonia Epstein, and I am our Associate Curator of Science on Screen here at the museum, and I am so glad that all of you could join us from near and far for Spaceship Earth, Reimagining the Future. This is not an easy time for anyone, as everybody is well aware, so it's particularly meaningful that so many of you could make the time to join us. And the silver lining of having these events online is that more people could join us than could have in person, including, I think, some of our guests. So I'm grateful at least for that. And I just want to say briefly before we begin that, as you can imagine, this is a particularly challenging time for the museum as an institution with our physical doors closed. So if you're able to donate the suggested $5 or really any amount, it would be greatly appreciated. Okay, so now on to Spaceship Earth. This is a superb documentary that I first saw when it premiered in January at Sundance, and which became even more resonant when I watched it again recently. I'm hoping that some of you have already had a chance to see the film and perhaps understand what I mean, but very briefly, for those of you who haven't, Spaceship Earth tells the story of a group of 8 people who lived inside of a self-made closed ecosystem called Biosphere 2 for 2 years, starting in 1991, becoming a media sensation. What is perhaps less well known, and what Matt's film makes clear, is that the group's origins were in counterculture San Francisco as an experimental theater troupe called the Theater for All Possibilities, which is a great name. So again, if you haven't seen the film, you can watch it by going to the museum's homepage, movingimage.us, and clicking on our unique link to Neon's virtual cinema. Neon has been a fantastic partner in helping us bring this film to you and this conversation. So I also just want to say thank you to them. So tonight we are extremely lucky to be joined by Spaceship Earth director Matt Wolfe, NYU environmental scientist Andrew Bell, and 2 of the 8 Biospherians, Leigh and Mark Nelson. So the way that it'll run, I'm going to invite on Matt and Andrew to start with, and then Linda and Mark. And at the end, we will have time for questions. So please feel free to chat those in the YouTube chat, and we will hope to get to them. Okay, so 1 second as I invite on our participants. And I'm hoping that you can help me in welcoming with a silent round of applause, Matt Wolfe and Andrew Bell. Okay, hello. I'm going to unmute both of you. Great.
Hi, thank you for coming to this virtual event.
Great. So to start, just to ground all of us a little bit, Matt and Andrew, where are each of you calling us from?
I'm in my living room on the Lower East Side.
And I'm also in my living room in Greenwich Village.
Cool. So Matt, I wanted to start with you. Obviously, when you were making this film, you had no idea that it would be released in this current time. And I'm imagining that probably you've rewatched the film, but also experiencing its release during a time when everybody is living in their own sort of closed ecosystem. How has your relationship to the film, or be it the film's subject matter, changed or been affected?
I actually haven't watched the film in a while, and it would be interesting to watch it now. I think one thing that I've noticed in my personal experience is that time feels really accelerated, even though we're doing a lot less. It feels like Monday was a few hours ago to me. And I know that the Biospherians mentioned when I spoke to them that 2 years flew by. And some of them, even in the film, say that they wish they could have stayed. And that resonates with me. I feel like when the quarantine is over, that we will have a different experience of time. But I think in a more practical and tangible sense, when I spoke to the Biospherians about their re-entry into Biosphere 1, they spoke about an experience of personal transformation, because inside Biosphere 2, with everything being so accelerated, they could really see and measure the consequences of their actions. And they were responsible for tending to their own atmosphere and harvesting the food they needed to eat. And they couldn't take anything for granted, not even a breath of air. So I think about that, about all the things I won't take for granted when the quarantine is over. But I hope that other people have some sort of personal transformation in which they recognize the impact that they have on the world and feel a renewed sense of responsibility toward others, because it's become much clearer how fragile our world really is.
For those of you who haven't seen the film yet, there's a little twist, which I didn't know, which is that, not to ruin anything, but Biosphere 2 was intentionally named Biosphere 2 so that people would ask, what is Biosphere 1? And Biosphere 1 is Earth. So, I mean, I don't think I ruined anything major by sharing.
That's a good spoiler.
Okay, so Andrew, I wanted to ask you, as an environmental scientist, I would imagine that maybe you'd heard about Biosphere 2, but I don't know. So I'm curious first what you knew about Biosphere 2 before the film, and then watching it, what resonated with you or what struck you or what were you surprised by?
Sure. Yeah, so I was a postdoc at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory in 2010, just a few years after the Biosphere 2 had passed on to University of Arizona, and they completed so much of the oceans work that they had done there. But I didn't know about it as a kid. But when I told my wife about this, she got really excited because it was a big deal in her school, and every kid got a little National Geographic booklet about Biosphere 2. And so she's known about this for decades. She's been really excited. I think, I can only look back on, I'm looking at the 1990s with literal, 2020 eyes. And everything I've ever learned about science, I learned after this experiment took place, and a lot of what I know about science is informed by things that happened in Biosphere 2. We know a lot about systems now, and we know a lot about the different scales at which processes in the Earth occur, and we know a lot about how all the different ways that oceans in particular act as this buffer to they're an important heat sink, and they're an important carbon pump, and they're an important source of oxygen in ways that we might not have been thinking about in 1990. I don't know. I have an environmental studies test that I took in 1990 that I love to show my students because I failed it. So I wasn't keyed into this in 1990, and I don't know how well the rest of the world was. But what I think is really, interesting about the experiment and the film is that there's an engineering side to it, but then there's also a people side and a social side, and we can think about on the one hand ideas like having a self-contained pod that we can put on another planet somewhere speaks to our desire to have space in other places. But in truth, we're not so much space constrained in Biosphere 1 as we are carrying capacity constrained. And there are all kinds of opportunities within Biosphere 1 to think about how to expand carrying capacity. So the American Southwest is a wonderful place, but there are other places like Afghanistan, for example, all these places where there are a lot of ways we can think about, how can we build up carrying capacity for people here in an environment where we totally have all the oxygen that we need and don't have to worry about it. So that constraint's taken care of. What are the other things we can think about? So I think that, things like this are really nice to inspire you to think along those lines.
Yeah. One of the things that I loved about your movie, Matt, was that I always thought that Biosphere 2 started as a purely scientific project, but learning that it was also in part, an artistic enterprise, or that artists were part of the origins of the project was, just very endearing in some ways. And I'm curious what drew you to this group of people in the first place.
Yeah, I think I was attracted to this group of people because they were quite literally trying to reimagine a world. And that impulse I found to be really intriguing. It did not surprise me that they were artists, because I think that is, in many respects, the mindset and the ethos of artists. And I also really understood the word experiment and experimentation in the broadest sense. One of the synergists, as they're called, the group that conceived of Biosphere 2, once talked about their life's work as a lifetime experiment. I thought that was a really beautiful premise. And in a lot of senses, Biosphere 2 was a human experiment. As this woman, Kathleen Gray, said, it is a voyage into the unknown. And then, of course, they were engaged in experimental theater as well. So in some respects, the project was criticized because of the word experiment and all the kind of institutional and academic associations along with that term. But in other senses, I think the ethos of experimentation from the point of view of artists and adventurers was central to the project. And I found that to be really captivating.
Yeah, that's great. I actually have a short clip from the film that speaks very much to what you're saying about experiment that I'm going to screen share. And for anybody watching, if there's any sort of lag, don't worry too much about it. I will, repost these when we post this video. So just saying that. Okay, bear with me for 1 sec.
I was tremendously frustrated by the criticisms and misunderstandings of Biosphere 2. Everybody focused on the carbon dioxide scrubber. People did not understand the point. We were people who recognized that climate change is a threat. Trying to develop a means to counteract that threat. Biosphere 2 brings you a visceral sense of how delicate everything is.
Okay, let me bring on our panelists. So as they're coming on, one of the things that, Matt, you were starting to say, are the ways in which Biosphere 2, and that I think this clip brings up, are the ways in which Biosphere 2 was misunderstood in a lot of respects. And I'd like to talk a little bit more in depth about the ways in which Biosphere 2 was and wasn't a scientific experiment. You started to talk about this, Andrew. I don't know if you want to jump in first, and then Matt, if you have more to say on the subject, for sure.
Sure. Well, it's a bit unfair to the project to attack it for not being an experiment in a strict sense. I suppose science is really two parts. There's the scientific method that I think we know all about. That's really all about taking ideas that people have carefully put together and just trying as hard as you can to rip them apart, tear them to shreds, and what's left over are the things that we hang on to, right? The scientific method is cruel, but the processes that lead us, that inspire us to build up all the ideas we've put in place to rip apart to begin with, there's no protocol or set of rules for that. There's no law about how we build on previous theory. And so, I mean, these kinds of things, wherever we're jumping out into things that we don't know and seeing new things, that they're acting as an inspiration to help build things that scientists might later try to tear down. So that, again, recognizing science as these sort of two halves, it's certainly a contribution to the former, if not the latter.
I'm sorry, Sonia, your mic's off, so I can't hear you.
Sorry. I was just asking if you had anything you wanted to add to that idea of, the ways in which the experiment was presented in the context of, a science experiment and maybe misunderstood because of that, or yeah.
I mean, part of what I think is appealing about Biosphere 2 is the rigor and ambition of its scope, and also the theatricality of it, the spectacle associated with it as well. And there were also these two kind of competing but interrelated objectives. One was to really pilot the idea of Mars colonization, and the other was to create a demonstration of sustainable living on Earth, and also to use Biosphere 2 as an apparatus or as a laboratory to understand atmospheric dynamics and a whole variety of ecological concerns. So there were a lot of different registers and layers to what was going on, but when the element of theatrical spectacle came into play, it thrust the project onto the world stage of the media. And in that context, the project, I think, became, in a sense, held accountable to a certain set of ground rules that its management, inventors, and participants hadn't necessarily defined. And of course, those ground rules related to breaching the closure or not, when in fact, I think when we think about science and any form of experimentation, we learn the most when things don't go as planned. But within the kind of voyeuristic spectacle of the media, there was no margin for error, or no, as the synergists often articulated, learning by doing.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, well, we have two very special guests that we'll be bringing on with us tonight. So before that, I'm going to play one more clip from the film, and then we will be welcoming on Mark Nelson and Linda Leigh. So again, bear with me for 1 second, and then we will start.
How can you prepare yourself for something that you don't even know what it is? That's what an expedition is. It's a journey into the unknown.
We can be a threat to our biosphere, play a destructive role, or we can be stewards, contributing to the reciprocal maintenance of natural ecological processes.
Let me close it, please. Please, I need to close it. Okay.
Change the number.
Okay, so I think you can see there some of the, fanfare that was surrounding that project. And yeah, so anyway, without further ado, please join me in welcoming two of the people who journeyed into that unknown, Mark Nelson and Linda Leigh.
Great to join you digitally, guys.
Great.
Greetings, everybody.
All right, very glad that we can all be here together. So to get right to it, Mark and Linda, I'm hoping that each of you could tell us to begin where you're calling from, and also, what you're doing there, and perhaps how long you've been there. Linda, maybe we want to start with you.
Sure. I'm living in Oracle, Arizona right now, and you're seeing my grow room, which is also my office. I grow a lot of plants, fluorescent lights in back, but it's also my office. Oracle's about 10 miles down the road from Biosphere 2 and about 30 miles north of Tucson, Arizona. It's a place that I've lived for, I don't know, maybe 10 years now. And I do have connection with the biosphere, but mostly about the history of the biosphere. I go in, I give talks to classes about how we built the biosphere and why we built it. And I take friends through the biosphere and I kind of watch its progress. It's a very different place now than it used to be. I'm working on the scale of community right now. We can all work and think about different scales in our lives. We can think about the scale of just ourselves, then kind of move up to a scale of our community, our neighborhood, maybe political boundaries, our state, our country. I made a conscious decision that I wanted to work on the scale of community. So what I'm doing right now is teaching people how to grow things. We started a community learning garden where we have classes for kids. People are learning how to grow food. They're learning how to do all sorts of things. I'm also a vermiculturist. I raise worms. I grow worms. So my two things that I love to grow are worms and plants. But the worms aren't just for the sake of worms. They're also great because I get food scraps from our local restaurants, so they don't have to send them to the landfill. So presumably that reduces the amount of methane in the atmosphere. And we get a beautiful, beautiful product of compost from our worms. So that's the nutshell.
That sounds great to me. Mark, what about you?
Let's see. I'm about 20 miles south of Santa Fe, New Mexico. And for those who have seen the film, I am at the now famous Synergia Ranch, which was where the Institute of Ecotechnics, our scientific arm, was born for about a decade and a half. It was the home base of the Turing Theater of All Possibilities. And it's also where I, in 1969, as a 22-year-old, overeducated, Ivy League degreed and completely impractical, fairly useless city kid, started to learn how to make a difference. So I'm very attached to this place. About 6 years later, I planted a 4-acre fruit orchard, went off to other ecotechnic projects in Australia, and then of course got involved in Biosphere too. And what we're doing, what Linda say is very dear to my heart, because I love being an organic farmer and orchardist, and that's what we're doing. My brother just said that we're a germ family because we've been kind of in group self-isolation for the last 6 weeks or so, but that didn't stop us from planting our gardens, getting the orchard ready for its season, and publishing books and doing the other things that we do here.
Yeah, I found your coming to Biosphere too, and before that, particularly, I don't know what the right word is, but inspiring, I guess. You also being from New York City, you know.
I was born in Brooklyn, which I'm really proud of, but it was 4 years in Flatbush. But I grew up in Queens, so I loved. I was actually looking forward, having met one of your colleagues at Sundance, to go there, and we're going to do a screening of Silent Running and Spaceship Earth. And I guess, the next best thing is to do this digitally and to, greet and be with people all over the world.
Next best. It's we have to do what we can. But on that subject, for each of you, Mark and Linda, I have 2 questions. Number 1 being, do you have any tips for living in isolation? And number 2 being, do you have any advice as to, I'm asking this because you've already done it in a sense, but as to how we might all think about reemerging from this isolation and re-engaging in the world, so to speak, in an intelligent way?
Linda, you want to start?
I could start. I don't find my isolation right now any different than I was before. As Mark says in his book, Linda Leigh is an eco-hermit. And I kind of am a hermit, and I probably will always be a hermit. So this kind of living is just fine for me. It's kind of how I've always lived. Inside of Biosphere 2, of course, we are responsible for creating our own atmosphere and growing our own food. On Biosphere 1, in the Earth, we are also responsible for managing the atmosphere and growing our food. So to me, those things are things that we should be thinking about as we're sequestered, however you are sequestered right now. Think forward to managing our atmosphere. Many people are in small apartments, and I just have a little anecdote here. When I came out of the Biosphere, I went to the dentist's office and there were no plants in the office, and I panicked and I said, "Where does your oxygen come from?" And then I realized, oh yeah, I'm so used to living so closely to the plants, to knowing where my oxygen, measuring the oxygen, measuring the carbon dioxide. And so I think if people can think about that as they're living in a little world without plants, maybe think about growing plants, think about growing your own plant, think about how we're going to change when we come out of the sequestration, think about how much cleaner the world can be and why that is right now. So that's it.
I'd say let me just build on that a little bit. That was a wonderful answer. Living with only 7 people in physical contact. This is before the internet, so we could meet people at the glass, but it was virtually soundproof. We could pick up a phone free of charge like the cosmonauts and astronauts can do. But physical contact with a greater group of people is really hardwired into humans. So I do find it, the unintended consequences or what happens. So, I was really thrilled and so proud and delighted with what Matt and his principal producer, Stacy, did with the raw material of Biosphere 2, but that it comes out in this moment of kind of global shock and a little taste of isolation for so many people who are unexpected or unaccustomed to it. I had lived in the Australian outback, which I think was way more isolated. Although we could drive to town, there was only, beer drinking Aussies we could hang out with. It was far more isolating than Biosphere 2. And, no doubt about it, it was really tough. And we had a power struggle on the outside, which kind of polarized things more. I think it would have been difficult. Nobody had ever done what we had done in living for 2 years inside Biosphere 2. But I always like to talk about the other side of it, which was that there was a tremendous respect, even when we sort of hated each other, that everybody was an exceptional person. They had made the cut to be a Biospherian. We all loved Biosphere 2 and we were growing up with it. So there was like a really deep bond to a higher purpose that really overshadowed and put into perspective interpersonal conflict, factionalism, all of that, and a very deep, profound realization that Linda was talking about, that every human being anywhere on this planet is metabolically inseparable from the biosphere. Like Matt was saying, we didn't take our breaths of air for granted, especially after the oxygen decline. I will never take oxygen and the 20% or so in the air for granted again. But there was that sense that Biosphere 2 was our lifeboat. And what's really wonderful 25 years after the Biosphere 2 experiment is that people are really waking up to that. It's become a reality to people that we have a tremendous impact on our biosphere, and our biosphere is not some environment outside of us. It is our life support system. So the really great thing about living inside Biosphere 2 was that all 8 of us, the transformation that Matt talked about, a large part of it was really understanding with your body, with your bodily intelligence, that I am part of this living system. I am responsible for it. Every action, there are no small actions. Everything we do has an impact for good or for ill. And if you're in a biosphere and you become a Biospherian, we're all Biospherians of planet Earth, Biosphere 1, you have a responsibility and a joy to be part of and to be responsible for your actions.
I think something that people also forget is that any of them could have left at any moment. There's a door, and people absolutely could have left. And the idea of coalescing as a group to make that commitment to stay for 2 years in a project that had significant pressure on it, both interpersonally and ecologically, really to me is an example of the power of group coalescence, but something that, and I don't feel like I think there's a kind of voyeuristic fascination with conflict inside, but there's less of a fascination on how people overcame that conflict to maintain their goal. And I think that's actually a little more instructive in this moment, rather than feeding on inevitable conflict as we enter this new world. But something that Linda said to me once that was really interesting is that when she was having, and Linda, you can tell the story, having a really bad day, you would climb up the trellis and go sit in a tree. And part of what drew me to some of the footage of the more mundane or even meditative footage that Roy shot inside Biosphere 2 was the idea of having a bad day and just going scuba diving and being underwater. And that stuff I feel jealous of, being confined in New York City in my apartment, is that proximity to a kind of a vast array of nature. And I'm wondering if you guys, if that was a relief from the pressure cooker of Biosphere 2, and if you did feel like you could escape into nature.
It was very important to me, Matt, to have all of that, to be able to climb up into the space frame and just kind of hide out. And oftentimes people would come up to the glass and they would kind of wave like this. And I felt like a bird that somebody was checking off of their life list sometimes, like, okay, got Linda, let's see if we can find Mark. Okay, got Mark, let's find Abigail. It was a funny feeling, but some days I loved it. Some days I loved the fact that people came up and a t-shirt saying it took me 40 years to look this good, and somebody brought that to me on my 40th birthday. It was, those kinds of things were lovely, but I really definitely take refuge in the natural world, and I really did hide fairly frequently from the people who were walking around the biosphere. So I would go into those areas where people couldn't see me, where I did not feel observed. That's one thing that most people cannot do right now, when they're sequestered. We don't have that wonderful living system around us. You've got books and you've got a place to sit and you've got all of these things, but hey, Matt, where are the plants?
I'm on the first floor. There's not that much light. They're in the kitchen, I promise.
Okay, good.
In New York City terms, I think of it, we were in a 2-year quarantine, but we were in Central Park. But we were even better than Central Park because there's that little horrible zoo. I don't know if it's still there. We had a rainforest and we had a Everglades system. And we had an amazing amount of diversity. And I think, in fact, at one point we did a shortwave radio hookup with people at the South Pole who were overwintering there. And, we home brewed, frantically, and feasts were really important. And I think, for anybody who's isolated, we struggled with our calorie restricted diet, which motivated. I love Linda, you once said we were really shitty. I've now done a violation of the code here. We were really poor farmers when we began, but I'll tell you, hunger really motivated us to learn how to produce every calorie and every delicious food. Our cooks, became so much more creative. But, so the people in the South Pole, they said, well, we could go out, but all we see is ice and snow. We have an unlimited amount of beer and booze we can drink. That kind of made us drool a little bit. So every isolation has its downside. But, if we were not in such a beautiful world, God only knows what would have happened. That would be kind of one of these terrible reality show turned horror story. And I think that, it's important. I think people who are deprived of that now, we have a project, the Institute of Ecotechnics in London. Now it's become a digital world art gallery. But our colleagues there say it's amazing. There's blue skies in London. You can breathe the air. And it reminds me, when we came out of Biosphere 2, we hadn't smelled the exhaust of a internal combustion engine for 2 years. They put us on a golf cart after the ceremony to go to mission control and a big feast. But, you know, when we smelled that exhaust of that car, it was like, why do people put up with this? So I have my own personal desire is kind of like, we've seen how fast nature is beginning to rebound when business as usual gets partially shut down. Let's come out and demand a world with clean air, clean water, food that you don't have to worry about, that's locally produced as much as possible. Yeah, so I mean, this could be a great
Healthcare
point.
Andrew, I wanted to ask you, and I think that Mark and Linda, and even perhaps Matt, from having spent so much time with this, you might all have answers to this as well, but this is something that the film doesn't particularly focus on because it's at a period of time, but I'm curious how the data from Biosphere 2 has been used since the experiment. And then maybe a little bit more for Mark and Linda. I'm also curious about all of the film footage and if that was ever used as data, because anyone who's seen the film, you know, there's just an incredible trove that Matt has woven together. So anyway, Andrew, is this something you might be able to speak to a little bit?
I mean, only a little bit.
Yeah.
Most of the work that I do is, you know, on sort of the people side of the human environment interface. But, you know, as one of the things that I alluded to in what I said earlier is, you know, like a lot of our understanding of oceans and scale came out of, you know, specific targeted experiments that made use of the Biosphere 2 facilities after the time that's shown in the film. And so, I mean, that's been immensely helpful to help us understand this, you know, the kind of how the sets of processes that were designed into Biosphere 2 really kind of linked to these much bigger scale, slower scale, sort of constitutionally constraining processes that govern how things, you know, work in Biosphere 1. You know, but I would imagine that Mark or Linda could probably say much more than I can there.
Just, I wanted to add one thing that a lot of people don't know is that we built Biosphere 2 for 100 years. When we closed the door, we put in the species, we put in the amount of carbon, we put in the amount of this and that for a 100-year closure. Of course, the people would come out and more people would go in. But we were building a system where we could study all those processes that Andrew's talking about, because we would have been able to study it for 100 years. Unfortunately, that was cut short. But the idea was to build the system, to have a system that was functioning, and then to really be able to study it. And some people later have been able to do that, but not as a total closed system, which is what we had hoped.
And not to put Mark on the spot, but the majority of data that was collected during the mission was not released. Part of the, I think, limitations of the project as being a private enterprise is that its data was considered proprietary intellectual property. And as a result, it hasn't been made accessible for scholarship or research. And I know that is, I imagine, upsetting and frustrating to all of you. And I know particularly for Mark, that's hard. But to answer your other question, and I spoke about this with a writer this week, I do think that the film, and Mark says this in the movie, the film footage that Roy shot is a valuable form of data. In fact, all the footage that everybody shot is a remarkable kind of corpus of information and data that allows us to glean knowledge and meaning from what you did. And that so much of the methodology that was at play in Biosphere 2 was one of observation, and that from my point of view as a filmmaker, there was just an immense wealth of observational data that helped me to find meaning in what you were doing, even if the empirical data that you so meticulously measured is not accessible.
Yeah, I mean, it's a complex story, and I thank you, Linda, for correcting some of the there's been so many misrepresentations of what Biosphere 2 is about that it's kind of like, where do you start? And one is that there was an overemphasis in the media, and maybe we fed into it with poorly worded press releases to overemphasize one, that 2 years, we were hoping the system would be good enough that we wouldn't have to, make changes and bring things in. And the whole space colony, certainly that was a long-term goal of the project, but it was much more, we wanted to make a new type of Earth study laboratory, a little slice of some of the diversity of biomes on planet Earth, incorporate humans and technology and farming, and figure out how all of those elements could work together with, in a harmonious way without killing the life inside. So the media if this was a prototype, if this was a Mars colony, if we had to import oxygen, oh yeah, the 8 people are dead. But that would be a really trivial reason to build something as magnificent and designed for many, many decades of operation. So our other hope, aside from that people would realize we're living in Biosphere 1, the only biosphere that we know in the universe right now, is that we wanted to give birth, and the fat lady hasn't sung. Given the stakes, that humanity has faced, where is Biosphere 3, 4, 5, 10, 100? So we begin to understand how biospheres operate. And one thing back to this question of, was Biosphere 2 science? Well, you have to realize, and I know Andrew is on this page, that most of modern science is dominated by people who look at the small scale, reductionist scientists. And the issue with Biosphere 2 is that, one, the group doing it, we were outsiders. Yay! If we weren't outsiders, we wouldn't have had the gumption, the chutzpah that we'd say in New York, to attempt such a crazy project. So we were looked at as outsiders, and seriously, a lot of reductionist scientists don't even understand that a system level holistic science, that we wanted to make ecology not only observational, sure, it's a voyage of serendipity, but actually, we're making an experimental facility. We're experimenting on a scale that, because of constraints of vision and capital and commitment of governments and institutions, is usually not possible. But given the stakes, the central premise of Biosphere 2 is, can humans, technology, and farming live compatibly and productively and healthily with a series of wilderness biomes? That is an optimistic premise for the experiment. I'm going to turn on a light because I realize light is fading here, and
You're fading away, Mark.
I know I'm turning into a ghost like the ninth Biospherian here.
Okay, well, while you're getting that, Andrew, did you have anything you wanted to respond to in that, or does that cover it for the moment? I think that the sort of scale is something that's definitely interesting. I mean, I think, yeah.
I mean, the only thing I would say, and this is something that, looking at Biosphere 2 in the experiment helps you think about is, when we talk about sustainability is a fun word to use, but the concept of doing something sustainably implies both sort of like intensive measures of like, how much land do we need for one person to be able to eat and live? But then these other extensive measures of, well, how many people are trying to do that? And so there's kind of two things happening at the same time. And it's a reminder that, it's very difficult to ever say that any one thing, the way we grow this plant or the way we drive this car is sustainable or not, because it all depends on how many people are trying to do that thing. And experiments and projects like Biosphere 2 really kind of expose this to us. Whatever's happening inside Biosphere 2, does it work for 8 people? Does it work for 10 people? Does it work for 20 people? And to really think about what that means. We can do anything that we like, as long as we're sure that we don't have more people doing that thing than we can. So there's two halves of sustainability that you don't hear as much about both of them at the same time.
Mm-hmm. So the two halves being scale and
yeah, and it's sort of like the
sustainability.
intensive versus the extensive, like the resources per person, and then how many people.
Yeah, interesting. So we have a bunch of questions, and I want to be sure to get to at least some of them. Again, if you do have a question, feel free to chat it in the YouTube, and we will try to get to it. But one question that I think maybe can build off of what we've been talking about says, if you repeat the Biosphere experiment, what would you change about the experimental design? Anyone?
Go ahead, Mark.
Okay. Well, one thing that jumps to mind is, and I was kind of alluding to it, that we had to redesign our technosphere. And if I had to redo it again, I would have made somehow that people could have seen all of the technical apparatus that was needed to keep a miserable little 3-acre biosphere, a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of our global Earth going. So, the people who said, this is a fantasy, humans are in charge of everything. We're trying to show that we don't need the Earth, that, humans and their technology are triumphant. When you realize that even making a tiny, tiny, tiny little speck of a biospheric system takes that much energy and that much technology, kind of like, puts you back into perspective and gives you appreciation for what the Earth does for us every day, every second of every day.
I also think it's worth noting just the kind of engineering feat that Biosphere 2 is, and that is largely to credit William Dempster, who you meet in the film as Freddy. And this was the most airtight, sealed structure that had ever been created. And the way he did it, I couldn't possibly repeat, but it was incredibly detail-oriented. He's a very detail-oriented guy. But we couldn't get into this in the film, but there are some enormous silos beside the Biosphere 2, which are beautiful design objects, but they also are the lungs of Biosphere 2. And there are apparatuses that elevate and descend to artificially create airflow in and out of the biosphere, because if Freddy had not designed those lungs, the air would have made the building explode or implode. And it's also worth noting that this was the early 90s. The kind of computer technology involved to control temperature, to create wind and sprinklers and all this stuff, it was really primitive computer technology, even the kind of video phones and video conferencing that people use. So there is this interesting tension in Biosphere 2 between something that is an intensely natural world and something that also is like a machine. And that also was part of the concept of this as a private enterprise, is that some of that technology could be exploited and scaled. And that's just another dimension to the innovation of that would have, I think, evolved as our technology, our understanding and tools of technology have transformed.
A couple of things I would have changed is I would have probably closed the door for a year before us humans went in to study the systems before humans were on the inside. I would have put probably less space frame up, so more light came in. On the other hand, that means more heat load. So thinking that through would be a really important thing, but there's certain areas where more light would have been very useful, particularly in terms of the effect of that on the atmosphere. Part of the waiting a year before we went in is to some extent because of the young soils. And a young soil that's been disturbed a lot has a lot of microbial activity because of all the oxygen in the soil. So you get a lot of oxygen consumption and CO2 production right away. If those soils had matured a little bit, and some people compare it to a bottle of wine maturing, we wouldn't have had those enormous amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the uptake of oxygen that we did have. So I think studying the soil more before we went in, letting the soil mature a little bit before we went in, maybe reducing the space frame would have been useful.
I have another question. Sorry, Sonia.
No, go.
Okay, it's not 100 years from 1991, but what do you think that system would be in what's 100 years from 1991? Like,
I mean, what does it look like?
1091.
No, what year would it be? I can't do math.
2091.
20. What do you think that system would be in 2091?
I think that if people were managing it, and if they were allowed. You mean if it was just closed and nothing else came in, I presume?
Yeah, if it had been the closed system it was
Sure.
designed to be for 100 years, what do you think it would be like in 2081?
If people were managing it, there probably would have been a huge collapse of species, which there was, which we anticipated by packing the number of species that we put in initially. But there would be a lot less species of everything on the inside. It would have. The concept of self-organization is a very interesting concept, but the system would have self-organized to a point where it probably would have had some kind of stability for the last 50 years or so in terms of the atmosphere and the reproduction of the organisms on the inside. So I think the rainforest probably would have maybe 60 species left. The desert would be very different, but it still would be a desert. Again, it depends on the management and how people are interacting with it to kind of shape the biomes.
But do you think that closed system, sorry, I'm going into documentary interviewer mode.
Go.
But do you think that closed system in 100 years would be completely different than the larger closed system of the planet in 100 years? Like, would it be protected from some of the atmospheric things that are happening here?
No, I mean, but Biosphere 2 is never designed to be some standalone survivalist, shelter. Although I went down to a NASA conference once in Houston, and I was totally scared out of my mind when Dr. Strangelove from the US Air Force asked me if a biosphere could be put into a mountain. And I think what he was thinking about is after the nuclear bombs go off, that all of the world leaders could go and shelter there. But I think, we hadn't totally thought that out. My opinion, because we talked about that, was that this thing about Biosphere 2 being completely isolated, I think is a little bit overblown. It's a biospheric laboratory, and we discussed certainly in lots of design meetings leading up to the first closure, that eventually there'd be genetic bottlenecks and there might need to be reintroduction of additional species. I mean, it's an ecological experiment. It is not, as H.T. Odom once put it, the press turned Biosphere 2 into this Olympian contest. Can you last in there for 2 years without, exporting anything or importing? That is not the spirit of a 100-year experiment. And in fact, we used to joke about all of the technology would someday go into a museum of antiquities of biospheric, equipment. We spent $20 million with Hewlett-Packard to do things and develop a computer sensor system that I'm sure you can get, at Best Buy for a few $1,000s now. We were probably 50 years ahead of our time. But on the other hand, what we were dealing with, the implications of showing people a different orientation, that here's humans who understand that they cannot just do anything they want to do, that there are wilderness biomes. And I love, Linda used to say, if the farmers come out here trying to convert the savanna and the rainforest into more farm, I'm going to beat them off with a pickaxe. But that was kind of the spirit. We're setting up, the demonstration was, hey, the humans, you've got a farm, you've got your habitat, and you can go out and take a few things from the wilderness, but you're not going to convert the rainforest and the savanna and the ocean into ocean beach, condos. That has a worth of itself. So I think also if that experiment had been allowed to go for 100 years, the people running it eventually would have many other, useful thoughts about what to do with it. It would never stay the same system that we designed.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to try and get to a few more questions. One of them that I found interesting is, we can see in Matt's film in Spaceship Earth and from your project that Biosphere 2 was, a collaboration across a lot of different sectors. And the question is, do you hope that certain sectors will work together after this, meaning I think the current pandemic, to solve Biosphere 1's problems coming to light now? Sustainability and marketing, farming and art museum. I think, Andrew, maybe you have thoughts, Matt. Yeah, anybody else?
Mark has been using the term ecotechnics, and that was really significant to people at Synergia Ranch. It's not a term I use in the film because there are a lot of terms, but the premise of ecotechnics is enterprises in which ecology and technology can coexist toward goals of sustainability. And, part of and maybe this will create some debate with Mark, I don't know, but part of my interpretation of the story is that premise that technology enterprise could facilitate ecological sustainability is a neoliberal model for envisioning the future of our planet, and that Biosphere 2 in some ways, despite its successes, allegorizes the limitations of that particular model of trying to protect the planet and its future. So I think what appealed to me about the project is that it was truly interdisciplinary in a sense that was outside of traditional categories of science, ecology, adventure, and art, and that the aspect of it that seemed to combine all of those fields was futurism and a kind of futurist outlook and spirit as well.
If I could briefly, without raising too much hackles, I'm okay. A few of the reviews have re-invoked a very old nickname I had when I was hauling horseshit from the Santa Fe racetrack to make the orchard. Yeah, I was known as horseshit for a couple of years, but that was in the context of intellectuals just go around spewing bullshit. Now, I put horseshit to use making organic orchards and farms. But I have to say, and I understand that Biosphere 2 is a very complex story, but to put the label of neoliberal on it, yeah, we believe in free enterprise. That hardly makes us crony or international capitalists. And Ed Bass, who has a really wonderful love of ecology, the only way he could keep his Texas banker friends and enemies at bay was to say, I'm taking 5% of my wealth and investing it in ecological and visionary and idealistic ventures. So I despise neoliberalism. I think it's destroying the planet big time. And I do understand, the people, when they look at that, I mean, my good Jewish mother from Queens, when she heard that Ed Bass at Texas Oil Man was bankrolling some of our projects, some of our later projects, she said, Mark, Moishe, what are you doing? Everything in context. But Biosphere 2, we underplayed it at the time. One of the reasons I think we got attacked, aside from the fact that reductionist scientists were threatened, the media just wanted to play ball with us, hyping us and damning us, was that it was really radical. It was revolutionary. There was no car inside Biosphere 2. There were wilderness areas that were there for their beauty, for their diversity, and which one of the Biospherians, highest responsibilities was to intervene and maintain the beauty and diversity thereof. It was an absolute rebuke to business as usual, especially as it's practiced by neoliberal economics, which turns everything into some monetary value, which is killing us and the planet. And I will stop my rant at that.
Okay, I'm going to talk about something that was a smaller scale that has to do with collaboration, which I think is what the question was about. Different areas
sectors.
Collaborating at different sectors. And this is just in building the biosphere. To me, thinking about building or putting a food web together piece by piece was equally as exciting as living inside. It was phenomenal because I got to work with specialists in different fields. I had a bat specialist. I had a moth specialist. I had somebody who really knew soils and really knew this. I had engineers and architects, and we all had to talk together. And we spoke different languages, believe me. So we had a bat specialist who said, yes, we should put bats in. But these bats that I think would work inside of Biosphere 2 have to encounter 100 moths every night in order to eat 20 moths every night in order to live. And that's one bat. And the moths have to be this big. So then we talked to the engineers and they said, well, what's going to happen is those moths are going to be sucked down into the air handlers unless we put a finer screen over the air handlers. And that's going to be a heavier load to pull the air through, and it's going to cost a lot more. So we'd have to talk to the person in charge of funding. So all of these things that we have to think about includes all of the sectors of Biosphere 2, the engineers, the architects, the people in charge of the money, and all of the different ecologists who studied one little part of the system and were experts in that, talking together with each other. And that was lovely. That was so exciting. And, I just really hope that we can continue that kind of a dialogue.
Can I ask Linda a question? Can I ask
Mark,
Linda?
you're beaming.
Was there interpersonal conflict between specialists in different disciplines trying to, like, that seems like a interpersonal conflict nobody would ever discuss?
Oh, yeah, there are all sorts of interpersonal conflicts because a lot of us took our area, we really personalized it. For me, I personalized the wilderness biomes. They were mine. And so anybody who did anything negative about, not letting me have enough water for my biome, that was a personal affront. Also, our specialists accused each other of taking over their biome by putting a weasel into the marsh. And that means we have to have more water in the savanna. And now you're being, just this person who's trying to take over the whole area. So there are all kinds of conflicts like that. They're kind of lovely.
The nerdy conflicts, not the soap opera ones.
But they're so reflective of what happens on Earth, and I think that's what I love about it.
I want to go back to the first drama that we had was getting the ecologists and the engineers to even speak the same language. I mean, seriously, my joke was they couldn't insult each other because engineers spoke engineering and ecologists spoke ecology. And the engineers freaked out, first off, when they saw the beautiful architectural design. They said, this is going to be really difficult to build. It's going to cost, way more money. Let's basically build a big box store, a big Walmart or a Target, and put the biosphere in that. And as, Matt was saying, our sensibility, our DNA is things need to be beautiful and beneficial, productive and profitable. So if we're going to, be crazy enough to build a biosphere, it's going to be beautiful. And then when the engineers realized that all their beautiful, innovative engineering wasn't going to keep the people or the plants or the soils or the animals healthy, that was going to be the role of the ecology, that the engineers were just like the supporting act. They freaked out because engineers like to ensure human safety and, that their project is going to, but when they finally got it, I have to say, when they finally understood everything that we put in there has to be compatible and supportive of life, they became really high morale. And I'm thinking, you're talking about the post-pandemic world. We should get all the engineers and ecologists to be talking and understanding that we're all working in the biggest closed system that we didn't build, which is Earth's biosphere, way more tightly sealed than Biosphere 2 could ever achieve.
Yeah, I mean, I think what both of you were talking about, particularly your description, Linda, reminds me of I think, something that's common in the sciences in that a lot of the different, specialty areas don't actually talk to each other. And hearing you talk about the way that, you were putting together this ecosystem actually reminds me of another fantastic film, The Biggest Little Farm,
Yes.
that, I feel like there could have been a whole other film about, which Matt's film does, show some of, which are fantastic scenes about, like, just creating this ecosystem and how you balance or don't balance all the different parts and make those decisions so that, one thing doesn't just totally dominate and that you can actually live there.
Yeah, we're so used to taking ecosystems apart species by species rather than putting them together. So it's a different way of thinking.
And that's something that I think film can also contribute, just what we were talking about scale. People were used to looking at things on a small scale, and scientific experiments are often done at a small scale. Film is one medium that can capture a range of scales in a very effective way. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up, but there's one question that I think we could all maybe answer. The question was, what were the main sources of entertainment in Biosphere 2? So maybe to wrap up, everyone here can go around and maybe pick one of their main sources of entertainment. Mark and Linda, you could do from Biosphere 2 and maybe now, and Matt and Andrew, you could do now. Whoever would like to begin.
Well, we all have cats. We had to quarantine all of our cats except Andrew, so that's my answer.
Okay. Mark or Linda, main source of entertainment in Biosphere 2?
I guess writing. For me, it was writing. It was journaling. And I really enjoyed doing that and sharing a lot of that information with people over the bulletin boards that I was involved with. We didn't have so much really fast internet or email. We had bulletin boards. And so posting those up and getting interaction from people on the outside, particularly people on a thing called the WELL, the Whole Earth Electronic Link, was really important for me.
Mark?
Yeah, well, I'd say watching our Galagos, they were amazingly entertaining, and they found us very entertaining as well. And, as we were shrinking, watching our visitors become larger and larger, which I think also was going on. And, Lynn and I were some of the 4 celibates inside. So I did more writing than I had ever done to date. And I had warned Sonia that I was going to do this. So the first edition of Life Under Glass was written by me and 2 of the crew members even before we came out. And I'm really proud to show that there's a second edition updated with new forwards, introduction, research highlights called Life Under Glass, available at your local bookseller or Synergetic Press. So, writing and digesting that experience day by day was an amazing experience.
Andrew, your main source of entertainment these days?
Oh, well, for us now, the key feature of our small apartment are the 2 small children that we have here. And so in fact, as we were watching the film the other day, I kept thinking, what we wouldn't do to have an extra room or an extra adult or a private green space. But they're both at they're 1 and 2, which is like peak little drunk person age. So that's that's everything. That's our entire day.
Yeah.
I also, just before people go, I want to mention that I don't know how you saw the film, but it's available from over 200 organizations and museums and independent theaters like the Museum of Moving Image. And both Mark and Linda are also participating in Neon's virtual cinema. Linda's community learning garden in Oracle is hosting virtual screenings, and you can tell people to rent the film to benefit the garden in Oracle. And then Mark, through the Institute of Ecotechnics and Synergetic Press, the publisher of his book, they are both hosting virtual cinemas. So if you'd like to support their work by renting the film, that's one way to do that.
Thank you, Matt.
Same goes for the museum. If you rent it through the museum, 50% of the proceeds go to the museum. So anyway, lots of great opportunities. Thank you, all of you, so much for participating in this. And that was to all of my panelists here. And thank you, all of you people at home, wherever you may be, tuning in. And I hope that you'll tune into future MOMI and Science on Screen events. I can tell you that the next Science on Screen event is going to be Monday, May 18th. And it's going to be focused on the science of yeast and bread making. And it will feature a live kitchen demonstration with Avery Ruzicka of Manresa Bread. And also this amazing botanist named Nicholas Money, who takes high-speed videos of fungi sporing. So it's called Dirty in the Kitchen, Monday, May 18th. I hope to see you there. And yeah, in the meantime, please take care. Thank you all.
Been fabulous.
Bye.